Hello everyone, I'm Hilary Aked, Medact Research Manager, and this is a Medact training session on making effective freedom of information requests. So what we're going to cover tonight, this session basically offers practical advice on how to extract information from public bodies and in the process increase transparency by making freedom of information or FOI requests. And it's suitable for people who have never made an FOI request before and those who have done but would like to improve their skills and understanding. What we're going to cover, firstly, what information the Freedom of Information Act entitles you to and from whom, how to draft an effective request and avoid cost exemptions, public bodies' legal obligations to help you find information, how to appeal against unjustified redactions or disclosure refusals, including how to argue the public interest case. And in the last half hour of the session, for those of you who are doing this workshop live rather than watching the recording, we'll also be doing some scenarios in small groups. Now, I wouldn't normally start a presentation with a quote from Tony Blair, but I'm going to do that tonight. And Blair said, "3 harmless words. I look at those words as I write them and feel like shaking my head till it drops off my shoulders. You idiot, you naive, foolish, irresponsible nincompoop. There is really no description of stupidity, no matter how vivid, that is adequate. I quake at the imbecility of it. How could you, knowing what you know, have allowed us to do such a thing, so utterly undermining of sensible government?" Now, the 3 words he's referring to are not weapons of mass destruction, but freedom of information. And I think the fact that he regrets passing the Freedom of Information Act in the year 2000 says quite a lot, both about him and about FOI. So I think the reason he regrets it is precisely because FOI can be a really powerful tool for a range of people, including researchers and social justice campaigners, not just journalists, to find out important information. And it allows us to sort of penetrate the walls of secrecy, which are essential to the exercise of state power. And he says, that it undermines sensible government, but actually the Information Commissioner's Office, which I'll talk a little bit about later, it's the kind of like governing body for information governance in the UK and FOI, argues that transparency should actually improve government and of course expose wrongdoing, and is, of course, I think you'll agree, an essential part of democracy because it allows us to hold power to account. Here are a few stories generated using Freedom of Information requests. Several of these relate to Medact's recent report, False Positives, on the prevent policy in the NHS. Okay, so firstly, just the basics. Which bodies are covered by the Freedom of Information Act 2000? Which was introduced, by the way, as part of a kind of stated government commitment to transparency and accountability. And it legally entitles any citizen, as I said, not just journalists, to request information from a wide range of public bodies and publicly funded bodies. And those include central government departments, local authorities, non-departmental public bodies, so things like the Arts Council, the British Council, universities, colleges, schools, NHS Trust, Foundation Trust, the police, the army, Quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, covered a lot of them. Basically, for a full list, check whatdotheyknow.com or a site called FOI Directory for an up-to-date list of the bodies which are subject to FOI. A few bodies that aren't subject to the FOI Act include private companies and, sadly for Medact, medical royal colleges. Also the court system and security services like MI5, MI6, GCHQ, you can't FOI those bodies. But there's a really wide range of ones you can. Okay, what information are you entitled to and is potentially covered? Again, a really wide range, quite a surprising amount of information can be requested. It covers any recorded information, this is the wording of the Act, held by or on behalf of an authority. And that includes documents, spreadsheets, correspondence, including emails and letters, diagrams, photos, PowerPoint presentations, video or audio recordings, any handwritten documents or notes, minutes of meetings. Also things like text messages and WhatsApp messages are also covered if they're sent sort of from a work account or in the course of somebody's work. Hello, sorry, just, can you can see the slides again right now? Great. Sorry, just letting somebody in. Okay, so that's what information is covered. Oh, we've got a young guest learning to do FOIs. Yeah, just, okay, thank you. So, okay, how do you draft an FOI request is what we're going to cover now. So, number one tip really is do your research first. So you ideally want to know that document X or Y exists. It should be a lot easier to get hold of it if you know that there is a project proposal for said project A or B. So, you know, check publicly available sources if you're researching something, gather as much information as possible first so that you can be as specific as possible in your request. Check the disclosure log, which most public bodies will have, and that's a website on their website that lists previous FOI disclosures to check that maybe someone has may have released the exact information you're looking for or related information already. And check whatdottheyknow.com as well to see if anyone, again, has made similar or identical requests to that body. A lot of them are public. Your request should be made in writing to the FOI or information governance team. Usually you can just find their email address at the bottom of the website. However, even if you send it to the press office, theoretically, they should share it with the FOI team, especially if you cite the Act and say this is an FOI request. If you want a tip for a website that really helps you to do FOI requests, again, whatdottheyknow.com is a really good way for kind of organizing your requests. You can just email it in or even write in if you want, but if you make it through whatdottheyknow.com, it keeps track of the request and when you should expect it, and it reminds you that it's overdue and tells you when responses come in. So you know, otherwise I'd recommend being really organized and setting up your own spreadsheet with when the date you submitted it, when it's due, and any developments. But that's a good website to use, that you can get a free account. If you use a free account, the public, your request will be public. If you pay for an account, you can keep your request private for up to 12 months, I think. So that, you know, if you're working on important scoop, no one else is going to sort of know what you're requesting. Okay, so yeah, cite the Freedom of Information Act, at the top of your request and specify whether you want the information digitally or as hard copies. And I really suggest, instead of asking open questions, you ask for original data and original documents. So instead of saying, what is the justification for, you know, project X, say, I'd like to see a copy of the project proposal for project X. And the reason for that is if you just ask, you know, why, they will give you like a short paragraph, which will be very sanitized. And if you ask for the original documents, you'll get a lot more data and you'll really understand like what's going on inside and how it's been justified by whoever's put the business case or whatever together. And finally, we have to think about trying to avoid like the time and cost exemptions. Okay, so there's a limit on how much data you can request. For a central government department, they put a monetary figure on it, which is £600, which is equivalent to somebody working at a rate of about £25 per hour for around 3.5 days to find and compile and go through your information and make any redactions necessary. For all other authorities outside of central government, they put it at £450. So that's equivalent to about 2.5 days work at the same rate. So in order to make sure they're not going to just reject your request by saying this is too much information, you have to be as specific as possible. So if you have, if you have a specific person's correspondence you're interested in or specific spreadsheet, say it. And I'd also recommend providing a date range if you can. So if you're only interested in January to March 2020, say that, because otherwise they're not going to know, and they're going to possibly think this request is too big and go back years and years looking for relevant information. Okay, so what are public bodies' legal obligations when it comes to your FOI request? Firstly, they should acknowledge receipt of your request. And it's worth chasing if you don't get an acknowledgement, because if after 20 days when you're expecting your response, you say, oh, where's my response? That they could easily say that this has happened to me, that they just didn't get the email initially and they didn't log it. So it's just worth making sure that you get an acknowledgement. A lot of bodies have automatic ones, and that's enough. But sometimes you may need to chase it. And theoretically, they should reply within 20 days, 20 working days. Now, obviously, during COVID-19, there are some legitimate reasons for things to be delayed, and you'll get a lot of public bodies citing that at the moment. Sometimes I suppose it can also be used as a pretext if they need to or want to. If it is going to be late, they should, in theory, let you know why it's taking longer than 20 days and provide you with a new rough deadline or estimated deadline. But in reality, you may need to, again, chase them and find out why it's late and when you can expect it. Now, under Section 16 of the Act, they are legally required to help you find the information you need. And that may suggest that another public body holds the information to redirect you, or if your request is too large, to help you understand ways you could cut it down that would be manageable for them in the time frame. And they should also assist you if you have a disability which prevents you from making a written request. Now, normally they should tell you whether they hold the information, even if it's exempt from disclosure. There are some exceptions where they may say, use the NCND, which is neither confirm nor deny, around things like undercover policing. The Met Police use that a lot to just try to maintain secrecy about whether X document or whatever even existed. But generally, they will tell you, even if they don't release it, that they hold it. Sorry, I'm just gonna, I think someone else has just joined the call. Oh no, maybe someone left. Called them. Okay, sorry about that. Where were we? Now, yeah, the other thing is the FOI Act is usually applicant blind. Now, what that means is I've had FOI officers come back to me and arguing about stuff I've written online and telling me that it's a vexatious request based on what they think I'm going to do with the information, or why they think I've requested it, and that shouldn't really be happening. So if that does happen to you, you just politely insist that you're entitled to the information regardless of why you want it or what they think you want to do with it or who you are. Next, if they refuse to disclose, they must explain the reasons why and make reference to the Act. Also, if the relevant exemption on which they're relying to not make a disclosure is subject to a public interest test, and I'll talk a bit more about public interest in a minute, then they may need to show that they've conducted a public interest test, which means that they weigh up the public interest arguments for disclosure against the public interest arguments against disclosure, and then they demonstrate why the public interest in keeping the information confidential is greater than the public interest in disclosure. So they should be doing that. Sometimes they're quite lazy with that. Now, for disclosures which are partially redacted, again, they should specify for each line or word that's been redacted or section that's been redacted exactly which exemption they're relying upon. So a model response would have every section, every redaction marked, section 23, section 41, and then those exemptions should be fully explained in the letter that they send you. They should inform you of your right to appeal and how to do so, and they should tell you in advance if there will be any charge. For example, if you've requested hard copies and it's going to involve a large amount of photocopying. Okay, now here, there are 23 exemptions in total in the FOI Act. These are 11 of the most common that I have come across making FOI requests. Now, many of these are what's called qualified exemptions, which means they're subject to a public interest test. And again, I'll talk more about that shortly. But a few of them are what's called absolute exemptions, where the public interest doesn't come into it, and I'll flag a couple of them. So just go through briefly, we've covered the cost time exemption. If it exceeds a certain amount of information in man hours, they say no. Information intended for future publication, that's a bit of an annoying one. I'm currently having a bit of a wrangle with someone about that. In theory, if the information is going to be released publicly anyway, they can just delay. But unfortunately, they don't always need to say exactly. They should, it's good practice to say when it's going to be released, but they sometimes will just say it's going to be released in future and not be very specific, and you can carry on waiting for a while. Now, national security is applied quite liberally, or anything remotely related to security, and sometimes the arguments they will give why it's a national security issue and could harm national security are quite absurd, but it is a qualified exemption, so the public interest can be argued. Same goes for the international relations. If you are making an FOI to the Foreign Office, they could well argue that you're, disclosing certain information damages relations with, another foreign power. But again, if you can argue the public interest test, you may be able to get something released. Law enforcement and the prevention or detection of crime. Again, this is often applied very broadly, and again is a qualified exemption, so it can be worth challenging. Policy formulation, and the next one, section 36, which is prejudice to the effective conduct of public affairs. Again, these can be challenged. Section 40 on personal information is an example of an absolute exemption where there is no public interest test, so there isn't really any point in trying to challenge it, provided it's been applied correctly to genuinely kind of personal information. Yeah, and then the last few are information provided in confidence, legally privileged information, and information which could prejudice commercial interests. So if there's a sort of private company involved or something that they want to copyright or have copyright, they might invoke that. But again, these can be challenged. Okay, so how to challenge your appeal or non-disclosure. Now, basically, when you make an FOI request, there's a three-stage kind of hierarchy of power or an appeals process. The first one is you would request an internal review. The second stage is if you're still not happy, then you would go to the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. And the third stage, which I've actually never got to, is if you're still not happy with the Information Commissioner's Office decision, you can then take it to an information tribunal. Now, just to be clear, the ICO wouldn't normally consider a case unless you've already gone through the internal review stage first, or unless you've sort of nagged the public body several times and you've got no response at all, in which case, you can go straight to the ICO. Or if it's severely delayed and you feel that the public body is simply kind of using it as a stalling tactic, which I think sometimes, the Home Office or whatnot will do, and just hope that you get tired and go away, you can go straight to the ICO. When you go to the ICO, there's a template page on the website telling you all the information that they want from you. At the level of internal review, what happens, the first level is you explain in writing why you're unsatisfied, referencing the Act, and it's really helpful if you can cite precedents where similar information has been released. And the internal review should be carried out by the same, you appeal directly to the same public body that you made the original request to, but it should be carried out by someone else, ideally someone who wasn't involved in the original decision and who is more senior. And if then you're not happy, you can go to the ICO. Now, some useful sources to consult when you're appealing. The ICO website provides a guidance doc, a long PDF on each of the exemptions, so all the ones on the previous slide and others, which takes you through how to understand it, how to interpret it, what the Act says, and some key decisions around it. So it's really worth reading those guidance documents, because if you can find that actually a really similar piece of information has been released, or the ICO has ruled it should be released, in your internal review to the public body, you can say, well, the ICO said this, so I think this is the same, you should make the same decision here. And ICO decisions are called decision notices, so that's what it will tell you about, and it's really useful if you can cite them. The Ministry of Justice also provided guidance documents. They're not available if you just Google them now, but you can find them via the Internet Archive. There are a bunch of blogs, information rights blogs like panopticonblog.com, foiman.com, and foi.directory, which you might find useful. And then finally, I use like 3 different books when I'm writing an appeal and see what they each have to say. So the first one is quite a long and hefty book called Blackstone's Guide to the Freedom of Information. That's like got the entire text of the Act in quite large sections. The next one is a really short one, which you can get cheaply from the Center for Investigative Journalism, and that's called FOI Without the Lawyer, which has some quite basic, well, not basic, but some brief descriptions of how to appeal and key features of each exemption. But then the best one, the most useful one I found, is Matt Burgess's FOI, A Practical Guide for Journalists. And it's like a nice length as well. Okay, so how to argue the public interest test. As I mentioned, it's probably not worth bothering to argue when something is an absolute exemption, such as personal information, so long as it's been applied correctly. So senior people in public life, such as ministers, should not have their names redacted because it's their personal information. When you get to low-level staff, then sometimes, you know, there's a legitimate argument for protecting their personal information. Yes, and as I've already said, where exemptions are qualified, they're subject to a public interest test. Now, the public interest is not actually defined in the Freedom of Information Act, but basically it refers to the interests of the general community or a section of it, as opposed to private interests. And it includes things like transparency, accountability, safeguarding the democratic process, and throwing light on possible wrongdoing. So if you're appealing and you're arguing the public interest case, you basically need to refer to both these general principles, such as, you know, informing public debate, enabling citizens to scrutinize policymakers, increasing trust in policy through transparency, and ideally refer to specific examples as well if you can. So for example, if you can cite establishment figures or even better, ministers saying there needs to be more transparency around X, whatever your issue is, or you can point to other cases where public scrutiny could have prevented wrongdoing in the kind of area that you're researching, then that's going to help your case probably. So you have to engage with the argument that the public body has made for non-disclosure or for redaction, and with the wording of the exemption as it's set out in the relevant clauses in the FOI Act. So you're basically getting your lawyer hat on here. And yeah, it's very useful if you can mention previous similar ICO decision notices where they've said that an information should be disclosed, because that sets a precedent. Okay. So just some kind of general tips, I suppose. Like, it's goes without saying, I'm sure we're all very polite people, but FOI officers obviously are human beings, and you might want to call them up and speak on the phone if you're not getting anywhere via email, or you just want to have a conversation to find out more. And both an email and in person, obviously being polite never harms your case and their will to help you out, I suppose, and find the information you're looking for. You have to be organized as well. As I said, set yourself up with a little spreadsheet or an Excel document saying the date that you made the request, you know, which body, the email address, and all the responses, and as many columns as you need, because especially if you're doing quite a few, you'll lose track easily. Otherwise, I've got like a color-coded system for mine, but I also use What Do They Know, the website tool, to keep track, because it's much easier that way. again, it goes without saying, but you have to be patient. It's a kind of not really an instant gratification game. You wait 20 working days for the first reply. You may then have to appeal. You may have to chase. So yeah, it's kind of a long game. Be confident, and by that I mean, like, remember that you do have a right to know this information as a citizen. Heather Brooke, who is one of the early FOI kind of advocates, and wrote a book called Your Right to Know, because that's kind of the attitude and the mentality that I think we should bring to FOI research. Be tenacious, because yeah, if you give up easily after one refusal, and then you won't get anywhere. But equally know when to stop if they really have refused information because it is personal information, or there is a kind of justifiable reason that it shouldn't be disclosed. Then you probably are wasting your time by arguing with them back and forth, or by trying to appeal to the ICO. So it's about exercising your judgment, I guess, so you're not wasting your own time. Be creative as well. What I mean by that is sometimes I've found that if a central government department, such as I had one case where it was the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, was sort of being very slow or denying certain documents existed. And I knew that there was another public body, well, it was a non-departmental public body, the Arts Council actually, which had been involved in the same incident I was interested in, and had been CC'd into some emails. And so when I FOI'd them, I actually got a lot more information about the same stuff I was interested in. So try and think, creatively. On another occasion, and this wasn't deliberate, a colleague and I had both made requests to King's College London for a list of the funders of a particular department we were interested in, about 6 months apart. And they had released lists to both of us with some funders redacted, but they'd redacted different funders. So it just so happened we could put our list together and have a complete list. It's kind of luck, that one. Now, I've also said make time to read disclosures thoroughly, which kind of seems obvious, but sometimes public bodies will try and bury the important information, the kind of smoking gun email or whatever, at the bottom, near the end of a sort of 80-page PDF that they will give to you, and they might release that 9 months after you first asked for it and you were first interested in it and you first thought this will be interesting and useful for my campaign or whatever. So and your life might have moved on and you might be super busy. So it can be, I found that when you're doing quite a lot, you don't have time, you don't make time to sit down and go through the information you get. But I really suggest doing that so you're making the most of the time you spent getting the information. And finally, enjoy the process, because you're not going to get anywhere again if you don't. It can be, sort of slow and boring and frustrating, but also there's a real thrill, I find, to eventually getting some important piece of information that you suspected was there, or that the more that they kind of push back, you realize there was something interesting here. Sometimes it's disappointing as well, but often it's quite exciting. Okay, this is the last slide, and then we're going to stop recording and come back to the group. So I just wanted to say something quickly about subject access requests and also environmental information regulations. So environmental information regulations provide even stronger access to information than the Freedom of Information Act. So, for example, information about emissions into the environment cannot be withheld on grounds of commercial confidentiality, which could happen with FOI. Then separately, this is like separate legislation, separate kind of request. We've got the Data Protection Act 1998, and that allows any person or data subject to make what's called a subject access request, or SAR, for what's called unstructured personal data that's held about them by a public body. So that means, so by unstructured, it means it's not in a file with your name in it, but it's like elsewhere in the organization. So it could be any letters or emails mentioning you, references to you in the minutes of meetings, notes of telephone conversations mentioning you. Now, for that, they may request ID just to ensure it is you requesting information about you. They don't want to give that information to someone that isn't you because it's personal. And they also may charge a fee, and that's usually £10. But they're worth doing if you're interested in, how you've been treated by a public body or similar. People do them, to the police, for example, to see if they're on this domestic extremist database that the police keep. There's more information in the link, which, as I said, I'll share the slides with people, and you can follow that link and find out more about how to do them.